Hi, I'm Neil and this is Trip the Road.
And this is the story of my first autocross build. This story begins in the rural suburbs of Clarksville, Maryland during the summer of 2017. I was offered a 1994 Acura Integra in exchange for some video editing services. At first, I was hesitant, but eventually I decided to go for it. The manual transmission and camo paint job were just too tempting to pass up. The car itself ran great, but it still needed a lot of work to get back on the road. Specifically, it needed new brake lines and a new steering rack. Every mechanic's two favorite repairs. For these reasons, I never actually got to test drive the car before taking ownership, but I could already tell it was a lot faster than my other projects. Loading a manual car onto a trailer with no brakes is an interesting experience to say the least, but I ultimately succeeded without damaging the front bumper too badly. With no time to waste, I pulled the car down to La Plata, Maryland, about a 70-mile drive from Clarksville. Here, the car would sit in the darkness of a barn for about 9 months. Late January into February has to be the slowest time of year for me. Not only does all the bad weather keep me inside, but every holiday worth celebrating was celebrated over the past few months. This chart I made visually represents how I feel about February. Anyways, back to my point. February was the perfect time to start working on this car. So me and my friends ventured down to La Plata, Maryland. There was just one problem. Remember how I mentioned how bad the weather gets in February?
Are you sure about this?
We're doing it.
All over. Stay on the gravel.
This is terrible. This is really bad.
I'd be afraid of something washing out, Joe. Stay left, stay left, stay left, stay left, stay left, stay left.
Holy sh**.
So what did you think? I just drove the van through that.
That was it. This.
My God. Oh.
No, give her.
Oh, he's making it.
He made it. Woo! He made it.
It's a really bad day to come here. Once everyone arrived, nothing really got accomplished for the first few hours. Every single surface inside the barn, car included, was covered in a thick layer of water droplets, and it was surprisingly warmer outside than inside. After a late lunch, everyone was ready to get started. Mike and I would focus on the front steering rack removal, while Brandon, Daniel, and Brian would work on the rear brake lines. Everyone else offered their help where needed.
So the brakes on the Integra are they're in pretty bad shape, so we're just going to go and replace all of the brake lines with these braided racing lines. There are instructions in the bags, but we have no idea. There's no pictures, so it'll be interesting.
It looks like someone's been here before. Zip ties, fittings, missing covers. It's a miracle this car didn't end up in a wreck. Routing the brake lines was actually the easier task of the two. While I knew the steering rack was a very involved project, I thought these eBay brake lines might give us more trouble. To our surprise, we only had one issue during installation, figuring out where the left wheel and the right wheel go on the ABS pump.
Alright, so what we got here is a OEM power steering rack, and we're actually going to convert it so that it's a manual power steering rack. The pump has already been deleted from the car by the previous owner. We just got to loop the input and output lines into each other, and eventually we'll put a T-fitting on there. We're going to attach a clutch reservoir, fill it with fluid, and that way it allows for expansion and all that stuff. This is the easiest way to convert the car to manual steering without making a bunch of modifications. This is This remanufacturing is done by Detroit Axle. I've heard good things about them, so I guess this is my first test to see how good their product is.
The internet says not suck.
Internet says not suck,
The
so.
internet also says that Abraham Lincoln was born in 1950 and he loved golf.
So one thing we noticed here is that they've spray painted these boots, which is a little sketchy in my opinion. It almost looks like an anti-galvanization compound, but I'm not sure.
Galvanizing paint.
So it doesn't hurt the functionality, but it just looks kind of lazy. So I guess
$5.
yeah. But it's not going to hurt the internals. We should be good. Hopefully this rack works well.
There's no better tool for this.
This is the tool for this job.
That's kind of what I had the feeling. There it goes.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, yay!
Sweet.
Sounded good.
It's the first time I've ever successfully gotten an exhaust bolt out without issue.
Wow.
That doesn't happen. Huh?
That doesn't exist. It didn't break?
It did not break. I think this thing needs engine mounts. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean,
That's
you're
not
doing that
enough.
with your hand.
After removing the exhaust and lowering the K-frame assembly, we fiddled with the steering rack for several hours, but were unsuccessful in removing it. I decided to remove more stuff that might be blocking it in.
The long boy. There's so much torsion.
He's got it, it's working. God, I hate everything.
It's becoming a gamble. Which one's gonna snap first?
You hear that, Mr. Tire? I like how it shakes the whole thing. Now, open it. I think it might have thrown something out.
Yep.
After removing additional parts of the car, we were still unsuccessful in sliding the steering rack out through the driver's side. So we ultimately decided to call it a night. To our relief, our return trip yielded no river to cross, and it bought me time to find the correct fittings for the steering rack. I also brought Blair along because he's really good at removing things that are hard to remove. We found that if we removed the tie rods, we could quickly drop the steering rack straight through the bottom. While we could have unbolted the tie rods, this is easier said than done and would have taken us a lot longer, especially since the steering rack was already unbolted from the frame. The exhaust manifold would also have to come out to make way for the steering rack. Since this car is a 4-cylinder, removing it was very easy. While I was at the parts store, Blair and Ryan managed to get the new steering rack into place. Since the new steering rack has no tie rods attached, I assumed that it went in the same way that the old one came out. It was a huge relief to have passed the halfway mark of this project. All we really had left to do was install a few bolts, install the steering lines, and bleed the brakes. Oh, and figure out where the center of the rack is and where the wheel should be. We determine this by counting the number of turns the rack allows and then dividing that by 2. So we turn the wheel 1.5 times from one extremity, disconnect the wheel, center the wheel, and reconnect it. While this didn't get us exact, it got us pretty close and we'll be able to fine-tune it later. All that was left was to take the T-fitting and the hoses and make the proper connections. 2 hoses would go on the steering rack, on the input and output respectively, and 1 would go to this clutch reservoir. This will allow for the easy filling and adjustment of the steering fluid level. Before taking the car off the stands, we thought it would be funny to start the car up without the exhaust. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure everyone outside the car lost a good bit of hearing. I also don't recommend doing this to your own car.
Oh, there's some flame. I can't hear shit. I got.
With the loudness test out of the way, it was time to reinstall the exhaust and drop the car down. What's more exciting than driving just after sunset?
Adjustments are on the way. It works!
I completely forgot how low the clearance was on this car. Everything else that I normally drive probably sits at least 6 inches off the ground.
Yeah, there should be one.
I haven't measured the clearance of this car, but I'd say it's pretty close to 3 inches. Also, it probably doesn't help that we're rallying in radials in a 2-wheel drive car. Lucky for us, the only tow point I could find was on the rear bumper.
This is how PG paves their street.
Your wheels aren't even pointing the right direction.
Wow, look at that
I'm
hydroplane.
amazed it made it this far. Like,
Yeah.
This thing still like feels like it's sliding. Look, I'm turning the wheel, it's still sliding.
This is definitely the most responsive car I've ever owned, and holy sh, is it quick. It may not look quick on camera, but it feels quick. And while it can go a lot quicker, we stayed on the path of caution. The roads were very muddy, and we wanted a chance to make sure that all the components that we replaced were replaced correctly. After 9 months, I finally got to test drive the car, and it was well worth the wait. Without the help of my friends, it probably would have taken me another 9 months to get this car back on the road. Everyone had some idea to offer that made the process of fixing this car much quicker. While we made significant progress to the car in this video, this is just the beginning of a bigger project. I have a few ideas in mind for the paint, and the car will need a few parts and some repairs before it's ready to autocross. One of the most glaringly obvious repairs we will now have to make is replacing these fender well covers, which came loose at some point during our first test drive. I'm not exactly sure when.
That concludes this episode of Trip the Road. We got the power steering turned into manual steering rack, put all the brake lines on, and we were able to take it for a test drive. Any grass that was on the property is now on the car somewhere.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.